Welcome to our poster, Voluntary Social Trait Expression in Voices. In these 3 experiments, we investigated the human capacity to exert flexible control over the voice, and specifically we were looking at the ability to manipulate the voice in order to express target social traits. The first experiment was run as part of Stella Goldner's PhD at the University of Mannheim. She invited 40 speakers to the lab, and they recorded sentences. These sentences were produced either in the normal or neutral voice, or they were produced in a way that would convey certain target traits. So speakers tried to sound, for example, confident, likable, attractive, and so on. We took these recordings and presented them to naive listeners, and those listeners were asked to give ratings of all of the recordings, including the neutral and modulated voices, on all of the target traits. Overall, talkers were able to change the trait impressions of the listeners when they modulated their voice compared to the neutral voice. And they were able to do this in a relatively specific way. So for example, here, when listeners were rating likability, the sounds that they rated as most likable compared with the neutral voice were those sentences that were recorded when trying to sound likable. Those of you who are familiar with the face perception literature on traits will also be familiar with the idea of there being a 2-dimensional social trait space that kind of describes how faces are rated according to their perceived traits. And in this space, one dimension characterizes something that is something like affiliation or warmth, and the other dimension characterizes something like dominance or competence. From our normal voice recordings, we were able to replicate this 2-dimensional space. This, of course, is a replication of a pre-existing finding from Phil McAleer and colleagues on voice trait perception. But how we were able to add to this was to show that in our modulated voice sounds, our talkers were actually expanding or exaggerating their voice within this 2-dimensional trait space. And what we did in our second and third experiments is to take a different way of measuring the success of these trait expressions in terms of listeners' perceptions. So in the second experiment, we asked listeners to choose from a set of 3 voice examples from a given talker, which one would best match a particular target trait. And they did this for all the different talkers, and we found that they could recognize above chance the target trait from these modulated clips. And finally, in experiment 3, we were able to show that these percepts would also generalize to social scenarios that go with these different trait labels. And so people were able to appropriately pick out the right example of a talker to go with a particular social situation. So overall, we present evidence that people are able to volitionally modulate their voice in a very effective and quite specific way to convey certain traits to listeners.